I'm excited for this one. Again, if you guys don't know who I am, I'm Sean Wakely. I'm the director of Hack For It. I'm really happy to see everybody in the room today. We have a lot of amazing programming over the next few days, so definitely check it out on the Treefort app. And also, if you haven't been over to the interactive space, it's like a pretty big party over there. I almost kind of want people to come over here, but I don't know. I don't blame them. So anyways, Mirko, I'll hand it over to you. And at the end, if we have time for Q&A, I'll help pass around a microphone because this is getting recorded. So we have something to put up in the future. So thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Should be about 30 minutes worth of presentation, so we should have about 20 minutes worth of Q&A time. All right. Let's see if we can get things going on the screen. Well, welcome. Today we're going to talk a little bit about UX and how we can utilize accessible design to improve the value of our UX through empathy. I'm going to have to change that. Let's see. Oof. Sorry, that was supposed to be for South by Southwest. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Good. So throughout the presentation, I don't like to put a whole lot of text on the screen. I don't like to read off the screen. So if there's big empty spots, I'm going to throw some photos of the dogs. So worst case scenario, you guys will leave here today and see cute photos of puppies. And hopefully you'll learn something, but that's the worst case scenario. This is by no means like a high intensity accessibility course. So it's going to be a bit more of a quick introduction into accessibility. And so if you're a developer or if you work in a UX space, much of the content today may feel a little oversimplified. But the idea is to kind of get people engaged, get everybody excited, and try to build a little trust. For the agenda, I'll tell you a little bit about me, what I do, where I come from. We're going to talk about just the general topic of what is digital accessibility and why it matters. We're going to talk about some common issues and pitfalls that companies experience. We're going to go into some best practices, how-tos, and then finally, we'll talk about a little bit of tools and plugins and eventually get into the Q&A session. So a little bit about me. I've spent about 15 years in the UX space, started as a web designer pretty early on, straight out of pretty much high school at the age of 19. And I never really left the field. I do have an engineering background, so I went to school for computer science, but never really enjoyed that side of development. So I focused more on the UX. As far as my work goes, in the last 15 years, I worked for just about every local tech company, not necessarily directly for them, but through either agency space or through contracts. So, Count, Clearwater, Cradlepoint, essentially all the companies I should have worked for. Equity and not an hourly rate because I wouldn't be here. Recently, I've shifted my work focus a little bit, and so now I'm mostly focusing towards usability and accessibility in design. And I'm currently working for a company called Human. Yeah, I did put that on there. Great. Where I work as a lead designer for their e-commerce experience, so anything that's digital. So first, let's discuss what is digital accessibility and really what it means. So it's honestly, it's pretty simple. Accessibility means that people with disabilities and can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, and that way they can contribute to the web as well, just like everyone else. Unfortunately, accessibility is really not a given. So it requires a lot of meaningful work and attention to detail. This is a really powerful quote of one of the inventors of the World Wide Web, Timothy Berners-Lee, and it says, "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." Internet was designed to provide everyone with an equal opportunity. So internet, it's not just for some. It's really the only thing that's purposely built for everyone. So, why does accessibility matter? Well, there's a number of reasons. First one really is moral obligation. So it's tough to fight against it, but it's the right thing to do, and it's, as designers, it's our duty to embrace it. UX is also really focused on designing for everyone, not just for some. So when you include everyone, you make a better experience in general at the end of the day. Next up, we have selfish reasons. All of us are aging. You're going to get old. And with that, your vision, cognitive abilities, and everything else slowly starts decreasing, which means if we're designing for accessible web today, we're going to be designing for it in the future as well. Top of that, there are very, very important legal opportunities. The ADA has been very active in the last few years. So just in 2020 alone, there were about 4,000, not 40, digital accessibility lawsuits that they have directly provided. And there's also a large amount of legal firms that are popping up that are solely focused on essentially hunting down companies who are not embracing accessibility and threatening until things improve. Top of that, there's a very large business opportunity. So you're enabling more of your customers to use and interact with your products, which means more consumers at the top of your funnel, and you can significantly benefit from that. Finally, this is kind of a small one, but when you combine all this together, there is some SEO value that comes out of it. So accessible design means good design, good code, which usually leads to better page indexing and better and higher page ranking at the end of it. So globally, 1 in 7 people live with some sort of a disability, 80% of which are invisible to the human eye. If you think about it, that's just over 1 billion people worldwide, essentially the population of China. That's 1 billion people that may not be able to order groceries, that may not be able to communicate with their friends, they may not be able to get their medicine from an online pharmacy. With 1 billion affected, we're going to talk a little bit about a rough breakdown of what that means and who these people are. So 1 in 25 people in the world are affected by some sort of a visual impairment. That means that they have either low vision or they might be considered legally blind. And what that means essentially that their vision is permanently reduced, that no amount of glasses, surgeries, or operations can really fix it. So you need to design or think through how they use and perceive the web. Next up, 1 in 12 suffers from some sort of a color blindness, deuteranopia or red-green color blindness being the most common one. So about 1 in 12 males and 1 in 200 females suffer with some form of color blindness out there. Let's see. Next up, we have dyslexia. This is a huge one. It makes just in general large chunks of text online to be read and understood properly. So it's something to be aware of. And then finally, this goes back to our selfish reasons. So 65 plus right now, that's about 1 in every 11 people with the current world population. As we age, especially when you get to about 60, 65, 70, our eyesight starts decreasing significantly, even if you've never had any eyesight problems. That number is slated to increase significantly. So it's going to be about 1 in every 6 by the year 2050. And so looking around the room, I would say most of us will be kind of hitting that retirement age around that time. So it's mostly this group that's actually causing that increase. When we look at the web as a whole, 70% of digital content is considered completely inaccessible to this user group. 80% of news websites, about 2/3 of all e-commerce websites. So if your goal is to sell products to a customer, you'll have this huge chunk of customers. 1 in 7 of your customers can't use your products. And then when it comes to public services, about 70% of all public service websites have problems. Some other markets, so banking, utility, and some core services, they do a little bit better job just because their businesses completely depend on it. But these kind of 3 top tiers of the web, they horribly perform. When they survey people with disabilities, they say if the website is not accessible to them, they're about 70 to 75% likely to just leave the website and never come back. So let's take a quick look at some larger e-commerce websites. So about 94% of the largest e-commerce websites in the world are not accessibility compliant. Now, this doesn't mean that they're completely unusable. It just means that they don't meet some of the most basic criteria to be considered compliant, and they have some work to do. So is anyone in the room already kind of in the UX space or familiar with some of the things like Bain Mart Institute? So Bain Martin, oh, we have a few. Good. So Bain Martin Institute is essentially where this data comes from, and they provide very in-depth UX and usability testing and benchmarking for e-commerce websites. So it's a great resource for anyone working in e-commerce space and in the UX space. And just because they use a lot of this data in the e-commerce space doesn't mean it doesn't translate to other things. So they're very e-commerce focused, but a lot of the data that comes out of it is really, really, really important. So another quick quote I'd like you to keep in mind as we go further. So Barclays Bank, they're much bigger in Europe than they are here. They're leading the way for a much more accessible web, and from the business perspective, they've seen nothing but a pleasant experience and an increase in customers and customer retention and brand loyalty out of it. So it's a large emerging market, and we need to build a business case for it. So businesses don't care about you. They don't necessarily care about how many users there are, but if there's dollars on the line, it's a much easier sell that goes to business stakeholders. So in addition to this group, we can also add a small amount of friends and family, caretakers, people who help people with disabilities. So we're talking about a user group of over 1 billion users with about $7 trillion worth of disposable income. Where do we start? Well, we know it's important. Business potential is there. Luckily, there are many online resources for you to start learning. The work has already pretty much been done. The rules and laws have been set, and you just have to take a little bit of time, learn them, and implement those laws. So I would say realistically, it's no more difficult than learning your local traffic and driving laws and just making sure you keep those on top of mind as you're driving around. You know, you're not blowing through red lights and keeping those things on top of mind. All right. The first, probably best place to get started when it comes to accessibility is WCAG. WCAG accessibility guidelines define how to make web content more accessible to people with disabilities, essentially. They have rules, and they make a lot of changes. They've been around for about 20 years right now, and currently they're on the version 2.1 of their rules and regulations. The last version of regulations came out in June 2018, and they have a new draft that's slated to come out in June 2022. All the rules that they put together are very additive, so everything that you learned in 2.1 is going to exist. They just add a little bit of nuance and information in version 2.2 as well. So when it comes to accessibility, there are really 4 main principles to keep in mind. That's Fally. She's 16. She has a tough time catching treats. Not a whole lot of text on this slide, so I figured I'd throw it in there. So first thing is users must be able to perceive the information that's presented to them. That's kind of like one of the core principles of accessibility. Users must be able to utilize and operate the interface the way it was intended, no matter who you are. And then users must be able to understand the meaning of the information that's being presented to them. And last and final one is that the product itself needs to be robust. This one's a little bit tricky to explain, but essentially what it means is you need to think of it through all the use cases where if you design a website today, it's not going to fall apart when a new iPhone comes out tomorrow, when a new device comes out tomorrow. This was a really, really big problem about 4 to 9 years ago, where a lot of websites had an M. domain name, so if you're on a mobile device, you had to go to a different URL to see the website versus building a responsive website. So responsive web design would be considered a lot more robust than anything that came prior to it. So now that we know a little bit more about the pillars of accessibility, let's talk about some of the basic solutions and the best place to start with something you can do essentially right away. So if you have a website or you work for a company that has a website, first thing you can look at is the contrast ratio of things. Technically, contrast ratio is the relationship between the luminance of 2 colors. It's pretty basic. It's pretty straightforward. In everyday language, you can think of luminance as the brightness and darkness of a color. So pure white has the highest luminance, and pure black has the lowest luminance, or essentially no no concept of luminance. It's just darkness, right? So we're going to discuss contrast ratio between the text and the background color and how that affects readability of the displayed content. So contrast ratio is rated on a scale from 1 to 21. Not from 0 to 1, not from 1 or 0 to 10, not from 0 to 100. And it's very easy and very intuitive to understand. I'm being very sarcastic when I say that because it keeps me up at night. It's my sleep paralysis demon. So the scaling is really difficult. So it's not 1 to 1, and it changes quite a bit. So hopefully, once I show you some examples, this will help you understand how it all works. So if you have black text on a white background, or vice versa in this case, that's going to give you a highest contrast possible ratio. So that gives you the ratio of 21 to 1 is how that's rated. But now on the other end of the spectrum, if you have white text on a white background, as you can see it here, you just can't see anything. To me, at least, it says that there's no contrast at all. And in my mind, I want to say that that's 0 contrast. But unfortunately, with how the scale is set up, that's actually ratio of 1 to 1. So it can be a little difficult to figure out where you are. So when it comes to acceptable contrast ratios, can anyone tell me roughly what an acceptable contrast ratio for text on a background would be? Don't be afraid to throw a number at me. 16 to 1, 20, okay? So it's not quite that bad. It doesn't need to be, aggressive as black on white text, so 21 to 1. It doesn't, so we'll have a few examples here. So the two numbers to keep in mind is 4.5 to 1 and 7 to 1. 4.5 to 1 is kind of the standard, and you can use that for pretty much any website. 7 to 1 is considered the AAA standard, and it really implies to websites that are heavily focused on text content. So you think of your Wikipedia, think of a news website, think of a scientific journal that just has large amounts of text. That's where you want to employ the AAA standard. But when it comes to AA, you can be safe for any website. So another question, a little pop quiz. If we look at it up here, I'm going to step away if I'll yell a little louder. So if we look at it from the far left to the far right, we know that this is the contrast ratio. If we know this is the contrast ratio of 21 to 1 with the pitch black text on a perfectly white background, and on the far right we have the contrast ratio of 1 to 1, where do we think we start actually? We're still within the acceptable range, and we actually start going into a range where we can be in trouble. And don't be afraid to just throw a number at me.
Like 12 or 11?
Yeah, so 11 in this case. So that 4.5 to 1 is a little bit tricky because it seems really close to 1, but that's actually kind of that middle point. So that's that middle gray. So the graph grows very exponentially, and it's really difficult to figure it out just by eyeing it. But yeah, that was a great call. So it's kind of right in the middle. Even if I reversed this the other way around, it would be in the exact same place. So now that we know how it works, let's take a look at a few examples together. We'll ignore some ugly color issues in here and just focus on the contrast and the contrast values themselves. So for this, do we think the contrast ratio is acceptable and it hits our 4.5 to 1 ratio? Yes. All right. Seems like everyone agrees. All right. That's a pass. Perfect. You guys are spot on. Okay. Next up, a little trickier. Okay. Perfect. So this is we're getting closer, but we're only hitting about 3.7 to 1. It seems bright. It seems like there's some contrast there, but it doesn't quite pass it. What about here? Fail. All right. You guys are right. We're getting very, very close now. We're getting nitpicky, but to a human eye, this may be enough. But if you're dealing with litigation, they usually use automated testing tools, and this would come through as a fail. Next up. Okay, good. You're spot on. So we're talking about 5.2 to 1. it's not great, but it gets us where we need to go, and it doesn't cause concern. So this is kind of if you're working with graphic designers, they're not the biggest fan of accessibility rules, but it doesn't mean you need to make your designs ugly. You just kind of have to work together and find a kind of a middle ground solution. All right, we got a few more. What about this? So we have kind of it's tough to tell up there, but it's like a purple text with a pinkish background. So I'm glad you brought that up. The color blindness part kind of goes away once you have the contrast checks in place, because you can think of it working on a black and white spectrum, and you can run into some issues if you had like green on green for deuteranopia, but in most cases, if the contrast passes the check, then there's enough of a luminance difference between the two elements that they can still read it. So this one, we're saying pass, fail. So this one's actually, this one passes with flying colors. It's 10.7 to 1. It's a little bit clearer on my screen, but you guys are doing a great job. And then one last one. So this is, technically it's a darker gray box with some white text on it. I don't know how well it shows up there. All right, yeah, so that's an easy pass. We're talking about 17.5 to 1. So next up, we're going to talk about text and typography implications when it comes to accessibility and how that all comes through. So there's really a handful of rules. One of them is you need to use an easy to read font. So just as importantly, it needs to be a contextual font. So if you're designing for the screen, it's usually a much safer route to use a sans serif font. It's a little bit easier to read. If you're doing a book, you can go with serif fonts, but unless the fonts are really, really big, it's a good idea to stay away from anything that's serif based. When it comes to font sizes, you want to do at least 16 pixel body font size. In some cases, you can go down to 14, but it's recommended you stay at 16 and up. And at the same time, you want to keep your line width optimal. So you don't want your text to go across the entire screen, because once you start getting past 50 to 80 characters, it becomes really difficult to keep track of your place as you're reading down the page. Top of that, this is a really, really important one. I see this issue on the web all the time. Never justify your text, and always left align your text unless, so there are a couple of little workarounds. If you're centering your text, make sure that it only wraps to 2 to 3 lines. If you have a whole big block of text, then you center it. It makes it really difficult to read. On top of that, another note on that piece is, if you're designing for a country that reads right to left, of course that flips around, so you don't want to be left aligning their content, but just something to keep in mind. Another big one is to avoid full caps for large blocks of text. So, if you're highlighting a word in all uppercase, that's fine. But if you have an entire paragraph or even a sentence that's all uppercase text, that can be really difficult to read with people with dyslexia. When you have a mix of characters, the words they create a shape. So even if you squint and blur, you can kind of make out what it is. But when you have everything in uppercase, you just essentially get a block no matter what the word is. So section of color and color theory is extremely important when creating inclusive design. So colorblind people make up a significant portion of the population. So we said it's about 1 in 12. Yet colorblind users are often overlooked when it comes to UI design. Most of us think of ourselves as trichromatic. It's a difficult word to say for some reason. And it means that we really perceive the world through 3 colors. So we see it through red, green, and blue. Different types of color blindness and color variations or color vision deficiencies come from being unable to perceive some of the colors as clearly as people without vision problems. So designing for color blindness doesn't mean you make your products less attractive. It just merely means following some best practices to keep your design process going. So an important rule to keep in mind is to create redundant, let me rewind. A really important thing to keep in mind is when designing for people with color blindness is to always create redundant cues for your users. So sometimes just a color distinction doesn't really carry the message. And so this doesn't only help people with color blindness, it also helps all the other users to identify the issues and problems that they may be experiencing. So in this example, if you look on the right, so this is someone that's suffering with the red-green color blindness. They would not be able to tell that the email field is not filled in correctly, and they would not be alerted that there's something that needs to be done. So let's see if we can easily improve this. So for all users, we can improve things by adding visual cues. So adding a small warning icon, adding some check marks, and adding an inline message, which will help indicate which fields have an error and don't have an error. So in this case, it says, please enter a valid email address. And ensures that people with color blindness can see it, but it also helps everyone else. So question for you guys. Are you aware of other ways of using the internet and using websites outside of just using your mouse or your trackpad? Yep. So screen readers and utilizing a keyboard is a very, very, very important part. There are some, specifically when using a keyboard, users end up utilizing Tab and Shift keys and then using Enter. There are some other controllers and devices that serve a very similar function, and they all work in a very, very similar manner. So when it comes to tab controls, as you can kind of see how this is going through as I was tapping through the screen. By pressing Tab, you go to your next clickable element. By pressing Shift Tab, that takes you back. And then if you hit Enter, that essentially acts just like you were left-clicking on a button or a CTA or selecting a checkbox. As you said, while these users are doing this, the screen reader is reading everything that's on the screen. And the big problem with this is it's not something you can control or address in the design stages. So this has to be handled on the code end. But you can be involved. You can test these things. You can QA these things, and I'll show some tools later on where you can create a system of checks and balances. Just as important as the tab navigation is really the structure of your content so people can understand it. So this goes for writing and also for the way it's created in the code by developers. This is starting to get a little more technical, but it's just something that you guys need to consider when looking at this accessible work. Zappos has a really, really, really great example. They're a large-scale e-commerce website, but they focus on good structure and accessibility, and it's easy to see how things are structured and organized on their website, even if you don't have any vision problems. So besides good structure, there are other small content-related things that we can do. Use of clear writing and language is crucial to the success of an accessible website. So one of the rules is, and this also translates to not just accessibility, when it comes to comprehension of content, but not using dashes. When a screen reader is reading a dash, it will say 8-10, and you want it to say 8 to 10 in this case. So unless you absolutely need to use dashes, it's something to stay away from. Abbreviating things is really easy, but when a screen reader says 10 mar, they may be confused people. Or if it says 10 twos, for Tuesday, it doesn't work. So just trying to spell things out whenever possible. Now, this can be an issue when it comes to acronyms, when you have really, really long strings of text. But the general rule is try to expand and explain your acronyms at the very least once. It's preferable if you do it whenever you can, but just do it once at the beginning so the user knows when they hear the word CSS down the road, what that actually means and entails. There's some other content. I'll try to kind of quickly run through some of these things. So alternative text is something that you associate with the images on your web. The screen reader doesn't know what an image is, but the alternative text is what they end up reading. It's really important for SEO and for screen readers to include this. But if you do have visual and decorative images in your designs, you can assign a value of null to that attribute, and that means the screen reader will completely ignore it. It's really just a pretty visual element that doesn't add value to someone who's trying to read it. Typing out all the important information, so a lot of websites really fail to do this, is if you have a graph or an image that has text associated with it or within it, it's really important to type out all that text in the alternative field That way the screen reader knows what's contained within that image. And finally, remove redundant content. A good way to think about this one is for, let's say, it's like Treefort's website. If you were to click on the Treefort logo, you want that alternative text to just say Treefort or Treefort logo in there. You don't want to say transparent image of a picture of a Treefort logo, because that just adds confusion and doesn't add any value to the user. And but some people go out there, they try to throw as many things into it, they try to overdo it, and that actually ends up having a negative effect on the experience. Quick example, I know earlier when I showed all the e-commerce companies, Apple failed on quite a few things, but this is the one thing that they tend to do a really good job with. So if a screen reader was looking at this and they said, front and back view of an AirTag personalized with the smiley face emoji, even if you close your eyes and someone says that to you, you know exactly what's contained within that image. So it's a good example of how to see how people are doing it successfully. So tools that will help you do this successfully, to test things out, figure out where you might have some pitfalls. There are tons of them out there. I'm going to highlight a few. I'm hoping tools will help you figure out what's wrong. Maybe if you have a website or you work for a company, and then hopefully prioritize some of the larger issues so you can get them getting quickly into the funnel, get them fixed, and then become either accessible or ADA compliant. You don't really need to be a developer or a designer to use these tools. Some of them are specific to both, but there's a lot of options out there. Chrome has quite a few really, really helpful tools. So WebAIM or their tool called Wave Evaluation plugin is probably one of my favorites. It provides visual feedback about the accessibility of your web content by injecting visual indicators live into your page. Wave facilitates human evaluation and education about accessibility issues in a really simple visual manner. And another tool that's very similar to Wave is the Accessibility Insights for the web. So if it helps you, Wave is the upper right, Accessibility Insights is the bottom two. And also earlier when we were looking at the REI website with the tab targets kind of following through as I'm hitting tab, that's also Accessibility Insights for the web. So they provide a visual guide and help developers quickly find and fix accessibility issues in their website. When it comes to design and design tools, there are tons. I mean, literally tons for all the tools for Figma, Sketch, InDesign, XD, InVision, or not InDesign, InVision. Really, the most important thing is find one that works. They all work off of the same formulas, and they essentially just check mathematical values. Find the one that works, find the one you're comfortable with, and the important things that you're using it. So now you have some tools. Just want to say that making the web accessible is really about leveling the playing field for the 20% of the world's population that can't access the web appropriately. It's a cross-functional problem, and everyone must be involved in the process if we're going to fix this. So it's a complex system of checks and balances that involves anyone from researchers, designers, developers, and really anyone that's willing to help and provide their help and input in that process. When it comes to web, it's a quick sprint, and it's not a quick sprint. It's a long marathon, and nothing's going to get fixed overnight. It may be 6 months to a year of thoughtful work to get to a point where you need to be. You can have a tremendous, or you or your company can have a tremendous social impact and a healthy return on your investment as you follow a roadmap that leads to equal access for everyone. More than 1 million people with disabilities in the world are eager to engage with you as customers, clients, partners, employees, and equal participants in civic and social activities. So public use of the web is more than 25 years old now. It's no longer a novelty, but an integrated critical tool of modern life. Thank you, guys. So if you guys have any questions, I think we have another 15, 20 minutes or so. So feel free to throw them my way. Woo.
If anyone has any questions, put your hands up, and I'll come around with the mic. We are recording this, so please use the mic. Thank you.
And only questions about this presentation, not the first one, not the accidental one.
The micro.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Business or a company, is there a technical way to identify a user with impairments and serve them specific content without violating data privacy laws?
Yes and no. It's usually not the best idea to do that. It goes back to the principles of accessible design, and it's that final piece where it's a robust. So you want to design for all and not find this outside lane.
Follow the general guidelines for all users.
You will know if a user is coming in with a screen reader. So, they usually just strip out all the CSS, a lot of the code, and things are available. But if someone has a vision impairment, where they can still see the screen, they may see your website at, 600-700% zoomed in. I should have included some photos of people actually testing websites out, and it's about 4 words on the screen. So like legally blind users will test the websites that way. There's also a lot of automation testing, and there are tools out there that specialize in exactly what you said, where you don't really need to do any work, and they just run on your website, and they can change things based around the user or the persona that's coming in. The problem is you're just throwing another thing on top of your website. It slows things down, and it's more of a patch than a permanent solution. So, but yeah, great question though.
Has there been any development for accessibility with like VR chat or anything like that, with like VR coming up, and how visual that really is? Has there been any discussion on where that's going to go and how that might be more accessible for more people?
Yeah, another great question. I don't know if I have an answer for it. If there is, I'm guessing there's a very specialized field for it. That's something I'll definitely have to keep in mind.
A couple colleges like Stanford, they did talks on user experience in VR. There's actually a lot on it. They're doing quite a bit. Like, should the room be big or small? How would you feel if it's an open sky or a closed room? A lot of stuff like that to help with nausea.
Let's say that I don't develop and I'm a very terrible artist. Is there anything that I can do to help with accessibility issues on the web?
Yeah, there are a lot of things you can do. So some of the tools that I've highlighted, you can go and just run those in your Chrome. It's literally a single click, and it will tell you, it will start highlighting things and say the text in here is not contrasty enough. Like you can go to Amazon's homepage, and then I know they're very litigious about how they do things when it comes to accessibility. You'll find hundreds of errors on the homepage, and it essentially what ends up happening, it goes through the design phase, it gets handed off to developer, goes through QA, and no one ends up catching it. And you could be that person. You could say, hey, there's a problem here. We need to address this. You don't need to know what the fix is, but if you can figure out what the problem is and then get it to right people, then they can actually work on it and fix it. So Wave Tool and then accessibility for web are 2 really, really great tools that you can use.
Do they help us find those people? Because am I gonna just like email the company, or how do I get this to the right place?
So it really depends. I mean, if you work for the company, I'm sure you have access to the team. If you don't work for them, I mean, you can start specializing in this field and say, hey, I found a lot of problems. You can pay me a hefty sum, and I will come in and fix these for you. It's kind of like how white hat hackers work. They break into a system, and then they reach out to you and say, hey, I found a handful of vulnerabilities in your system. I'm not a malicious actor. I'm not going to report you, but I can help you fix these problems for a nominal fee. So you can just email them as well, but yeah, thank you.
I mean, I have an idea what the answer to this would be, but in the design process, where does this accessibility fall with, empathizing with all users, really? I mean, and you have to really,
I mean, it should really fall within the entire design process. The problem is not everyone is aware of what's happening. So, like for example, at my work, I usually do all the initial research discovery phase and everything else. We build out a first rough draft. It gets handed off to our UI and graphic designers. They dress things up a little bit more, and then more than half the time, I go through and say, "No, we can't do this." But instead of just saying, no, we can't do this, I try to make it an educational process, and I try to kind of train them and have them understand at least what I understand from the accessibility side, so they can also embrace that process. And the idea is really you want it to be cross-functional. So everyone who's working on this should be aware, whether it's a stakeholder, a researcher that's trying to figure out what these personas are or who the users are, to your initial wireframes, to your designers, to UI, to a developer that's putting it all together. It's a very cross-functional process. And
so the forefront, really, in the beginning.
Yep, and then at the beginning, you just need someone who's going to raise their hand and say, "Hey, we need to take a look at this," because if you don't, as I mentioned earlier, ADA is getting very, very litigious lately, and then there's just a lot of ambulance chasers that don't work for ADA. They know what the rules are, and you may get a letter saying, "Hey, you're completely non-compliant. We're going to pass this information to ADA unless you pay us $4 to $15 million to fix it for you." So I've run into that in 2 jobs now. So
Thank you.
Have you developed or are you considering developing a standard or guidelines for like decentralized web applications that interact with the public blockchain network?
No. That's the most in-depth answer I can give you. No.
Why not?
I don't know enough about it. I think
Okay.
that's ultimately the reason. I'm sure if I did, or if there happened to be a class coming up, that sounds very interesting to me.
Okay.
What time is the class?
Tomorrow, 3:00.
3:00. All right. So
It's not my class, but
what advice do you have for students and others who are wanting to enter this field with a structure specifically focused towards accessibility and holistic design?
I mean, just like with anything, and just like anything with UX, empathy is just crucial. You need to care about what you're doing, otherwise you're essentially ticking boxes, on a spreadsheet, and it's not going to make you go above and beyond. So, but if you have empathy for what you're working on and you're entering the UX space with that empathetic viewpoint, that's really, really, really helpful. For me, I didn't really like care about this up until genuinely up until a few years ago, until I realized how big of a problem it is. And then I made it my life goal to just focus on this on the UX perspective. I still handle a lot of UI and early research, but majority of my work has now kind of shifted towards accessibility and just building a better web for everyone. Oh,
That was gonna be bad. So I see a lot of the web space going into dark mode at this point. Is that an automatic boost for accessibility as far as visual impairment goes? Or I know it's easier for me.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily more accessible, but it does help with fatigue of the eyes. So, shifting colors, shifting towards warmer hues in the evenings. It could be, but as far as the actual mathematical formulas behind contrast and accessibility and what the numbers you need to hit, it doesn't really change anything. But from your perspective as a user, it may improve your experience just because it's easier to read late at night. No one wants to stare at a bright white screen with small white text on it late at night in bed. So more and more users are in bed on their phones. So. Got a few more questions. Let's see. We have another 5 minutes, so.
Do you have any, whether it's personal, professional, or hard resource recommendations for accessibility and social media use. Just I do social media planning for like a college office, and whenever I'm doing my camel case hashtags or writing my alt text, I always feel like there's more I could do, but it's like hard to gauge. If you have any recommendations for resources.
WCAG, especially with some of the new rules that are coming out in June, a lot of them are going to be about text and content structure and improving clarity. So I don't know if they're doing anything for something as specific as like camel casing, but I do know exactly what you're talking about. Baitmart is just it's a great resource. Even if you have nothing to do with e-commerce, they give you really good detailed breakdowns of what's good, what's bad, what users they want. They really focus on the front end and the actual user interviews and interactions. Most companies just skip the user interviews and focus groups because it usually yields a small amount of qualitative data and it's really difficult to scale. So someone might spend an entire week interviewing 15 people versus I can run like a quantitative study on the website and get 300,000 responses in about 6 hours. So I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. There's empathy, try to find things, try to find ways to test it. But I don't know if I have a solution for specifically for social side.
I actually have a question for you. So obviously these are all things that we should be taking into account at the beginning of a project moving forward. In situations though where somebody has some sort of thing that they want to reevaluate and try to come into WCAG compliance, given resource constraints and competing priorities, what do you think is the best thing to focus on as far as bang for your buck, as far as effort put in and how broad it can benefit an audience?
Yeah. So I think the best and biggest like LOE versus money spent is going to be using those third-party tools. So one of the one I've had good success with for websites that don't have time to spend months redesigning and changing everything up is using a tool like Accessibility. They run an overlay. They can detect if users are using screen readers or if they identify as someone with a visual impairment, and they can automatically switch your content, your website, zoom things in automatically increase the contrast, essentially using your browser. So they don't change anything on the code level, but they have formulas of how they shift hues and colors. So if they know someone has a specific color blindness, they will try to push the colors to the extreme where even if you're not accessible, those colors will be still easy to differentiate. So, I mean, that's the cheapest, fastest option. It's not the best. It's like a gas station burrito. You're going to be satisfied, but you may pay on it in the long run.
So it sounds like you've gone through these, projects where I feel like have you ever made a UX experience and then it goes to the coding level and it somehow loses the inspiration? I was wondering if I'm a UX designer in the industry, what is your recommendations and how should I speak to software engineers about this topic? How do I mesh? How do we explain our ideas and come up with things together?
I think you just described my entire career in UX. So I was a graphic designer at first, and then I designed a handful of websites. Just absolutely hated what they came out when they were actually built out. So I was at BSU going for my graphic design degree, and overnight switched it over to computer science and computer information systems, so I can learn the development side of things. One thing that I strongly recommend is just getting familiar, at least with the basics of what the developers are dealing with and what is feasible. So in the agency space, and so I worked for bodybuilding for a short little bit. Wednesday afternoons were our days where all designers would learn the basics behind HTML and CSS and just roughly how code works. So you don't need to know how to build something, but you need to be able to understand if it's really feasible and how much level of effort goes into it. For someone who doesn't know how to design or code works, something may seem really simple, but it may be a difference between 15, 20 minutes worth of work on a developer end, or it might be 3 months, an entire research team to figure out how to build something. So it's just getting yourself as involved as you can in these other parallel lanes, so you know how to speak the language, or at least have a a shared vocabulary where you can figure out what each other are trying to do. So hopefully that helps. It's a I don't know if there's really a right answer, but
Yeah. Just in projects, I've noticed that it somehow gets lost.
all the time. And for me, what I like to do is we have a dedicated QA team, but I will jump in on the final QA and I do UI QA, and then I go and I ask questions and say, hey, this looks very different. Is there a reason for it? And a lot of times they say, oh, we didn't notice it. There's about 10% of the time where they say, oh, that was going to take way too much effort. No one just communicated that back down to me because we could have changed it or redesigned it or addressed it. So, you just get everyone in the room at the beginning, get any questions answered, try to figure out what's going to be a problem or not. And, you're not going to know things off the bat. So things are going to change, but you want to have as much control as you can over that change.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's anything else.
Uh-oh.
Hello.
Oh, we're out of time.
Oh, damn.
Sorry.
Most of what you presented is regarding visual acuity and which the web mostly is. Are there also guidelines that are designed kind of around managing cognitive load and sort of unburdening?
There are.
user?
It's like a science on its own. It's not something I am super familiar with, but the idea is you make your content simple, streamlined, as short as possible, and to the point. You allow the user to understand what you're saying instead of overcomplicating things. But there's really no silver bullet for it. So they're judgment calls, and then it's a constant iterative process of slowly looking at things, improving it, trying to figure out if you can sharpen things up a little bit. But it's
tricky because everyone tries to sound smart.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's everything is about a conversion. Everything is about a sale, trying to talk your product up. But, sometimes maybe it's a little easier if you just highlight a couple of points and leave everything else off. Good question. I think that's it. I think we're over time. So.
All right. Mirko, thank you so much. That was great. All right, guys, we got two more going on. We have one more. We have Brady getting on here really soon. I think that's going to be really interesting. Brady's also going to be joining another guest who's coming, Brendan Dunn. It's going to probably dovetail into some of his conversation today. It's going to be really, really cool. So definitely check that out. And then next door, we also have the Future of Streaming panel. So.